And so, welcome everybody for the November University of Texas speaker series, our monthly speaker series. I want to introduce Chris Bardash, the mapping branch manager at the Texas Department of Transportation, TxDOT. Today, Chris is going to talk to us about vector tile base maps and web GIS via TxDOT perspective. So, Chris has been working as a GIS professional for well over 10 years and has had different positions, one at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, and has currently been at the TxDOT for over 4 years. So, Chris, I want to thank you for being with us today. And everybody, if you're interested in doing questions, go ahead and post them in the chat window or raise your hand, and we'll take questions at the end. So, Chris, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you. Mute everybody, and we appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope you all enjoy this little talk that I'm going to give. This is essentially two presentations that I've stuck together into one under this common theme that we presented at this summer's Esri user conference. And Esri also published an article in one of their newsletters about the Arc Pro project. So this is what we're going to talk about, is utilizing some of Esri's new technologies for streamlining our web GIS. And like I said, I'm going to start with this first presentation about using a single Arc Pro project to publish all of our services. So the problem that we were having is that we have 40 or 50 quote unquote official services out there in AGO, ArcGIS Online, and we have an open data portal that is the the window into viewing those official services rather than the rather messy AGO backend. Well, when we first published those services, we used an MXD for each one. When you publish a service, if you haven't already, for those of you who haven't, anything that's in your table of contents in the MXD gets published to that single service. So you can publish a service that has multiple feature classes in it. But in our case, we wanted one feature class to be one service. And here's just a list of all the services that we were publishing. And so because of that, you have to manage a separate MXD for each service. And it just gets a little messy, as you can imagine. When you have so many, it's difficult to keep up your standards sometimes, and just to see everything all in one place. And there's no QA, QC involved in the MXD at all, really. So the solution, after coming back from the previous Esri user conference, was to use Arc Pro. We use Arc Pro a little bit in our shop, but for the most part, we're still using Arc Map. And so we're trying to move towards using Arc Pro more, and this was one step in that direction. The nice thing about Arc Pro, and what I'm really going to talk about here, I mean, this isn't rocket science at all. So super simple stuff, really. But Arc Pro just makes some of these processes a little bit easier. And so the things that I'm going to talk about that make it easier are the fact that Arc Pro has, map windows. And so as opposed to an MXD where you can only have one data frame, in Arc Pro you can have many. And so here you can see that each one of our services is represented as a map in the Arc Pro project. The other thing that I'm going to talk about before I move on with that is tasks. And tasks are another aspect of Arc Pro that help with the QA/QC process. But as far as bringing in those maps to create each one of the individual services, well, it's really easy, and there's a couple ways you can do it. What we did is since we already had all of those MXDs, you can just import the MXD as a new map tab in your ArcPro project, or as my slide says, ArcPro, since I did a bulk find and replace of ArcPro with ArcGIS Pro. But anyways, you can just simply import the MXD into your ArcPro project. And as you can see here, it just comes in, it looks, virtually the same. You don't have to change into any of the symbology or anything. So that's really pretty seamless there. And that's in fact what we did. Alternatively, you can simply create a new map and add your data to it, just like you would in any other normal, typical workflow. Once you do, then you symbolize how you'd like it. And one key lesson learned here is that the way that your feature class shows up in your table of contents is the way that it will show up in the table of contents or in the web map where you view that service. So if you're viewing a service in AGO, you open it in a web map, and in the table of contents, it will look like it does here in that bottom little screenshot. However, you can also add data from ArcGIS Online in either ArcMap or ArcPro, and when you do that, it will show up in the table of contents like this. So a lot of people use underscores or camel case or whatever for their naming conventions in their FDEs or shapefiles or whatever. But you should just know that once you publish a service, this is the way it's going to look. So that was one of our QA steps, was to make sure that the naming convention was correct. It wasn't plural, didn't have underscores, etc. So that's where tasks come in. So tasks are a new feature that ArcPro has, and we utilize them here in this instance, and we have plans to utilize them a whole lot more. Tasks are your way to control the workflow, and there's a lot of power within the tasks, anywhere from completely manual, just narrative text to tell you to do something, all the way down to geoprocessing tools and Python scripts that you can embed within them. And so I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. Here, I just want to say, you'll see then my screenshots here of my tasks that they're called template. And that was because I actually built a task to use as a template. And part of the task was that the next user would create their own task from the template. So I don't want to confuse you too much with that, but basically they could copy this task and use it again with a little tweaking. So all the tasks are a set of sequential steps that are repeatable, and they guide the user through to ensure consistency and quality. And they're really pretty useful for that. So we'll look at some, kind of what the basic structure of them is, and some considerations for setting them up. So the first thing that a task is useful for is just to simply guide you through, just like a workflow diagram or a workflow application. They're also particularly good for new employees who don't know exactly what your process is, especially if you have a complicated process. And that's where, for us, we have a very complicated editing process to get it into the application that we use to manage all of the highway assets. And there's a lot of places in there where people can mess things up. So not only for publishing services, but for our everyday workflow, we intend to use more and more tasks. The other thing is that they're interactive. So it's not just a workflow diagram that you look at that you can easily skip around and miss steps. you have to work through the process. And here you can see in the screenshot, there's a run button, there's a next step button. And as you configure these tasks, you have different options and those buttons will appear or disappear based on how you configure it. They really improve efficiency because as opposed to inputting the parameters and outputting the output location where a feature would be saved, for example, in a geoprocessing tool, you can set all of that up in advance. So all the user has to do is run the process. And of course, by virtue of all of these things that I'm talking about, it improves your quality of your data, which is super important to us. The other thing is that, as you can see in all those dialogue steps in this task, those are all things that I wrote. And so you can configure the tasks and write in there anything that you want to write. You can use your own language. So let's look a little bit about how to create a task. I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's fairly simple. The first thing you start with is a task item. And so here you can see up in the insert ribbon in Arc Pro that you can insert a new task item. Because when I say tasks, what I'm really talking about is task items, and task items can have multiple tasks and multiple steps. So here's our template task item, and this is just a task that I created for you making new tasks. So the first thing is to create the task item, and then inside of that, you create the actual task, and you can put a description in there. And then are the individual steps. Now, so far, I've only used one task and have been able to encapsulate all of the steps that I needed to accomplish that task within a single task. But it is possible to create multiple tasks, and each one of those have different steps. And I could imagine that in a more complicated workflow, where, for example, you have a series of steps that you need to do, and then perhaps somebody else has to do something else outside of the purview of Arc Pro or the task. And so you would need to end that first task and then start up a new task. But in this case, all of the steps for publishing a service are within one task. Each of the steps are sequential, as you see there, numbered. And they have commands to move the task to progress from one step to the next. And furthermore, some steps can be required or optional. So let's look at some of those behaviors a little bit more. Below, when you're configuring, so we're looking at the Task Designer tab or wizard here. And so here you see you put in your name, the name, and there's a tooltip. You can type in your instructions here. You can even type in some instructions on, how the task will proceed. And you have these choices highlighted in the red box there. So manual, that means that there's going to be a button for the user to run the task or simply to do something. And then the user has to proceed. They have to decide when and click to start the next step. Auto run, these next two are similar flavors of the same thing. Auto run is that the step runs automatically as soon as they move to that step, but then they have to click next for it to proceed to the next. And there are various scenarios of why you would choose one of these or another. The next of that same flavor is the user clicks the button to run, but once it runs successfully, the task actually automatically steps or proceeds to the next step. The next is fully automatic. The step runs, and then it proceeds to the next step on its own. And then below that, you can choose whether or not that happens in the background or whether the user gets to see that happening. And again, it depends on the scenario. Perhaps it's a geoprocessing step where the user wants to see some output while it's happening, for example. And then finally, as I said earlier, some steps are dependent, and so the user might be able to skip them if they're not relevant, especially in manual cases where they have to check something, that maybe they don't need to check it in this instance, so they can just skip it. If you choose that option, then there's a skip button at the bottom. So like I said, it's not anything super complicated, but we just wanted to streamline our process from managing 40 MXDs to managing a single one, and ArcPro helped with that. And then we wanted to get into using tasks, and this was our first foray into doing that, and we plan to use them more. It really helps to control the quality of work. And we talked about some of the design considerations. So I'm going to move on to the next topic, which is vector tiles. And then at the end of this presentation, we'll open it up if anybody has questions. So, vector tiles. So TxDOT publishes its own basemap service. And not a lot of GIS users or agencies out there have a need to do this, I suspect. But larger agencies and statewide agencies and national agencies could and do, because they have their own data that they want to show, and they want to show it in a base map so it renders faster rather than as a bunch of layers. So we need a base map here at TxDOT because we have our own specific set of data that we want to show on the map and highlight. And we don't want those to be layers. We just want them to be there in the background and render fast. So we have TxDOT districts, we have planning boundaries, and then most specifically, we have our own roadway network. And so that's important because when we are planning projects and when we are locating things in our mapping applications, we need them to locate on our network. And Google's network and Apple's network and Bing's network and everybody else's network is slightly different. And while ours isn't perfect and is sometimes out of date, it's our network, and that's important for us in managing our own work. So here you see an example of an asset. In this case, it's a project. In the blue kind of arc to on the north side of this image, where there's no road underneath it. So that's because we hadn't digitized that road yet, but that's an asset that we need to show on our roadway. So that's why we need to be using our base map. So let me talk a little bit about the old process. And if any of you are producing base maps, you might still be using raster base maps. And hopefully after this talk, you give some serious consideration to switching to vector tiles. But we were producing raster tile base maps for many years before now. And it was a very onerous process. The MXD, building the MXD to create the base map took many hours of work. For one person, it usually took them, among their other duties, several months to put this thing together, because there's a lot of fine detail so that your map renders properly at every zoom level. Previously, for the raster base maps, we were managing that in an MXD, and the way to do that is to create group layers for each zoom level, as you can see in the screenshot on the right. In addition, at each zoom level, you want to have certain layers turn on and turn off. So you will have to put a definition query on each layer. Furthermore, you'll have scale dependencies, and then each one of those layers, if you use dynamic labeling, is going to have its own queries and expressions that you use so that certain things turn on at certain points and others don't. And I'll just give you an example. When you turn on our base map at the state level, you only see interstate highways. And so if you only see interstates, then you only want to see interstate shields on those highways. And at the statewide level, you might want those shields to you might want only one shield to show up on each interstate, or for them to show up every 4 inches apart, or so on and so forth. As you zoom in, you want other types of highways to come on, and you want their shields to come on. And you only want you might want them to start to render more densely every 2 or 3 inches, for example. Maybe you only want shields for 2-digit highways to come on at first, so they're not so overcrowded. And then later, you want 3-digit highways to come on. For example, Interstate 10 versus Interstate 410 or 610, and so on and so forth. And as you can imagine, with all the layers in your map, as you tweak each layer and the symbology for each to be thicker or thinner at each zoom level, and the labels for each zoom level, it gets incredibly complicated and difficult to manage. And if after you produce these, you decide that you want to make one small change to one label density parameter, for example, you have to go through every zoom level that's turned on for and make that same change. So I can tell you, as somebody who's managed this before, that it gets extremely difficult to keep track of everything. Furthermore, dynamic labeling doesn't work very well in base map creation. It basically doesn't work, period, although there are some really very simple cases where you can use dynamic labeling. So that means that you need to convert everything to annotation, and those annotations are scale dependent. So you have to have an annotation for every layer in each group level, at each group layer in each zoom level. So you can see here, our annotation is pretty extensive. So the issue with that for us is that it's just a huge duplication of effort. We recently changed the schema on our TxDOT roadways layer. So that meant that for that layer, every single every single layer in the table contents for the roadways in all of those group layers for each zoom level, and every label definition query had to be rewritten because our field names changed. So that was a disaster. Took a long time to recover. There were lots of cases where you thought you changed everything, and then the map didn't render properly because you missed one of those. You missed one of the field name changes in the label query. And a lot of times, you wouldn't what gets rendered in the final product versus what you see in the MXD is different. And so sometimes things wouldn't show up until you actually rendered the base map. Another thing about the rasters, just to finish off this aspect of the talk of why they're so difficult and why vector tiles are so wonderful, is that you had to create these polygon layers to weight the boundaries of where each of the tiles would be drawn, so that you wouldn't have a label drawn at a tile boundary. Because all a tile is a JPEG, essentially. It's just a screenshot of the extent that it's zoomed to at that point. So the way that it works on the back end when you press the button is ArcMap zooms to that extent, like you see in the polygons here. It takes a JPEG it tags it with a lat long, and then it zooms to the next and does it over again. Well, anything that's on the boundaries, which is why dynamic labels doesn't work, will get clipped. And so you have to use these polygons here to show you where those boundaries are going to be so that you don't put anything on the edge. And if you do use some dynamic labels, that they don't get placed on the edge. So all of this amounts to a big headache. And for us, every time we add a roadway, we have to add annotation for it at every zoom level. And if we add hundreds of roads a year, it's hundreds of roads times 22 zoom levels of annotation. So not sustainable. On top of that, raster tiles have their own set of little problems. And one of them is how long it takes to produce them. We had tried to do that on a PC. It takes about 5 to 7 days on a fairly strong PC for the whole state of Texas. And it's difficult to get a PC not to crash at some point when you're doing that. You can also process them in AGO, which is very expensive credit-wise. We've done that before. It has its own set of problems. But most of all, the problem is it's just too expensive. We also used Amazon, which we had the best luck with. But again, you have to pay for that, and you have to ramp up a pretty big instance to crank out these tiles. And then once you do, after all is said and done, if you find a mistake like here in downtown Houston, for whatever reason, no interstate shields drew. Well, you're already invested into a months-long process, so pretty much you're stuck with that. So vector tiles, which is what we're really here to talk about, but I think it's really key to talk about what a pain raster tiles are compared to vector tiles so that you really see how wonderful vector tiles can be. So right off the bat, takes us 10 minutes to produce a vector tile base map service on a laptop. And that includes uploading it to AGO. And that also includes going down to zoom level 22, which we had never been able to do before because the cache just gets so big when you're using rasters. So that right there was a huge selling point for us. But the other part is, we use Arc Pro. You use Arc Pro to create vector tiles. And it's just a lot simpler. There's no group layers for each zoom level because you can control the zoom extents, the scale ranges for each layer and for each label class individually within the layer itself. And so you only need one layer for the most part for each feature class you're putting in your table of contents. And once again, because of that, you don't have to duplicate all those definition queries and run the risk of messing one of them up. The labeling is dynamic, so there's no annotation. And here's where you can see that you can control the scale range. So here we have interstates coming on first, and then US highways and some business interstates and so on and so forth. And you can see the scale range gradually getting smaller and smaller as you go down. So that's how you control the symbology. In other words, whether you even see the line on the map or the polygon or point. And then there's a similar interface for the labels to let you do the same thing for labels. So you could have a layer turn on and see it, but have it not label until later when you zoom in again. The nice thing is you can get all this set up. The map's a whole lot easier to set up. Still is time consuming to set up a big base map like this. So it's not like it's totally easy. But once you get it all set up, the beauty of it is that you run it, wait 10 minutes, you can look at your service in an application or an AGO, zoom in and out and see how it's actually going to look and feel. And if you don't like it, you just simply change something in your ArcPro project and republish it. So here's that same area of Houston, now with vector tiles. You can see that, if you symbolize everything the same, the vector tiles can look effectively exactly the same as your raster tile. There's some slight difference, which I'll show you at the end when I do a little live demo. But as I was showing you before, with the raster tiles, you invest all this time to produce it, and then you kind of, if you don't have any major glaring issues, you just accept what you have. Our old raster tile base map has missing tiles. They're only at the closest zoom level, I think zoom level 17, but there were some missing tiles, and it just wasn't worth it for us to go and reproduce them. They're really small, little like postage stamps, but there's just missing data there. But with vector tiles, you just run it again and run it again and run it again. Some other nice things about vector tiles, if you have a raster tile base map and you have an application that consumes it, changing from raster tile base map to vector tile base maps is, one line of code difference, or two really. You can see there in the bottom. So it's super easy to change over. I think it's the JavaScript API 3.16 maybe where they made the change. So anything older than that, you'd have to upgrade your API. But that's been a while back, so you should be okay unless you have a really old application. We did have to update our API to use vector tiles, but it didn't really require any other work. So we didn't have to change much code. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention there is that you can edit the JSON. This is actually something we haven't really explored too much, but it's a really cool aspect of vector tiles. And you can do this with Esri's vector tiles. You can save a copy in AGO. You can copy a service item in AGO, like one of Esri's base maps. And you can use a style editor, a JSON style editor, to change the styling. So if you've worked with any CSS or JSON in the past, it's really pretty simple. For example, if you just wanted to change some colors, you just go and edit some RGB values in the JSON, and you save that to your new service, and you can really quite dramatically change the look and feel of your vector tile base map without publishing a new service. You just have, it's kind of like a layer file. You just have a new set of symbology that's defined within that JSON file that points back to your original vector tile service. So that's pretty sweet. That's something that we intend to utilize. So for example, if you have a couple applications that are utilizing your base map and you want one of them to be really stripped down to just have a few of your layers, you can go in and edit the JSON just to turn off those other layers. So you can use your same vector tile base map. So that way, if you are publishing regular updates to your base map, they are precipitated across all of your other copies of the vector tile base map. So if you had one that was like Esri has like their light gray and their dark gray, you could do the same thing with yours. And your light and dark versions, your night and day versions, would point back to your single official vector tile layer. So anytime you publish an update to that, your light and dark versions are automatically updated. You do that with JSON. So there are some downsides. Mapbox were the ones that first came up with vector tiles, and you can still create vector tiles through their resources and tools. I'm talking here strictly about the Esri tools for creating Esri vector tile base maps and storing them on AGO. And so in the transition from Esri, taking on Mapbox's creation, they had to map out, for example, how all of the settings that you tweak in ArcPro get converted over to the vector tile base map. And they're still working on those, and they're not all perfect. So some things that that happen are that shields don't look the same. This is common for any base map creation, whether it's raster or vector tile. There is a translation that happens from ArcPro or ArcMap to the actual service. And so in that translation, not everything happens seamlessly, and not everything renders exactly the way that it looks in ArcPro or ArcMap. So these highway shields like I-35 there, they look great in ArcPro. Trust me, I wouldn't publish anything that looked like that. But when they get translated over, they get cut off. And fixing them is not easy, and sometimes not even possible yet, because they haven't really written the specification for the translation between the settings that you set in ArcPro and what gets actually rendered in the vector tile. They still have some boundary overlap issues, like you see the two 290H US highway shields there that are overlapping, but that's fairly rare. And they haven't even worked that out in their own vector tile. So it's just something you kind of have to deal with if you're going to go down this route. And then the other thing that's, it's an issue with all the raster, with all the base map services, is there's no overwrite option. So that's just something that we've had to be dealing with for years. They say they're working on a solution, and we complain about it to them all the time. But essentially, if you have an official service layer out there for your base map, you have to delete it and republish. Now, back in the raster tile days, that was a super scary prospect, because you had to completely delete something that you knew worked, and then start off on a very long process that was ripe with potential for problems in order to replace it. So you'd have to do that over the weekend, and if something went wrong, you'd have to have some kind of backup for your applications that were using it. In this case, I've already republished our vector tiles many times. I just wait till the evening sometime. I delete the service that's out there, and I publish a new one, and in 10 minutes it's back up. So easy enough. So with that, that concludes my presentation on using ArcPro to publish all of our service layers, and also using ArcPro to publish the new vector tile base map. So now I can open it up for questions. Brian, if you want to unmute people.
Sure. Ollie and Patrick, I'm unmuting both of you, and let's see here. We can take some questions. I'm gonna unmute
I
Chris
see one in
as
the
well.
chat there.
Yeah. Let's see. Sam Adams has asked a question, and it's: are vector tiles available in any projection?
I believe so. We use the Web Mercator Auxiliary Sphere that is kind of the web standard. So that's what we publish ours in. So I can't say from experience that we've published using other coordinate systems, but I believe so.
Yeah, I believe AGOL will convert it even if you have it in one coordinate system and you try to publish it, but I have to double check. We got Eric Pena has asked you a question. Did you have any issues with symbology carrying over when importing MXD from ArcMap? Going, I assume, to Pro.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that's related to the first half of the presentation. I will say for the vector tiles, we started from scratch on those because it's just so different. And it would be more complicated to try to bring the MXD over and re-symbolize that. But going back to the individual services, those are all symbolized really simply because you want your symbology to carry over to whatever AGO will support. There are some more complicated symbols that AGO doesn't support, and so those we weren't using those already anyways, you know, so I didn't have any problem bringing them over from an MXD into ArcPro because they were already really simple symbologies to start with.
Yeah, understand. Yeah, that's I always try to keep it simple as well. So, looks like we have Ed Carter here. So Arc Pro is like the old Arc View in terms of opening multiple windows in one MXD. And, Jordan had a
Yep.
comment that Pro does not use MXDs as a new file type, which Jordan is correct. But if you have any
But
comments on that.
you can import an MXD into your project.
Yes, into Pro. Let's see here. Ollie. So you can open multiple maps in a project file. So Ollie made a comment there. Kira has a simple message. Well, any other questions for Chris? This is being recorded. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel very soon after the presentation. And yeah, we'll see if anybody has a few more questions here. Trying to figure out if I have one. Oh, I do. I do have one, Chris. So now that the time to publish your vector tiles has decreased dramatically compared to the rasters, which if anybody's done it, he's 100% right. It does take a long time in setting it up. Are you using AGOL to tile your services, or are you doing it locally on your hard drive to save credits?
Yeah. Okay. Good question. Yeah. As with everything, I mean, with all of this base map stuff, it seems like there's a dozen ways to do everything. With one of the newer releases of ArcPro, it wasn't 2.0, or maybe it was, I don't know, but the first time we started creating vector tiles, you had to create them locally and then upload them to AGO yourself. Or there was actually a geoprocessing tool. Now in ArcPro, it's all one step. You can still do it the old way, but you can publish it directly up. And I believe what it does behind the scenes is it creates the vector tile package locally on your computer. And so you can navigate to that and find it for later. And then it, in all in one fell swoop, it goes ahead and automatically updates or creates a service and uploads that to AGO with it.
Okay.
So you have a lot of options there. You can just keep creating vector tile packages locally, and then you can go into AGO and upload it and create a new service. But now with the new version of ArcPro, it's all in one process. It's really pretty slick.
Yeah, I agree. Let's see here. I don't want to miss anybody. The chat window is blowing up here. Go back up here. So, do you see any need to keep using raster tiles as well as vector? From Sam Adams.
No, one concern that we had was that vector tiles are not supported in some older browsers. We went ahead and switched over our statewide planning map. Actually, I'll show you that now. So here's our statewide planning map, and you can see the URL up there if you want to take a look at it. We went ahead and switched over our versions, our base maps in these maps to the vector tiles, and I was fully expecting to hear back from some people using older browsers that it couldn't work. I have not heard one thing. So that was previously our only maybe or if question on that. It was whether or not we'd be able to, or we'd need to continue creating the raster tiles, but I don't think we will.
Okay, right, that's a great question. Jordan Camona has another question here for you. I think this is more of a TxDOT related question. Do you have a timeline or wider adoption in your group of adopting, ArcGIS Pro?
Yeah, we have a lot of custom tools and toolbars that we use for our internal processes here that are built for 10.3. So we're still using 10.3. We might move up to 10.5, we'll see. But starting in this new year, we're actually having Esri come and teach us a class on converting those tools over to ArcPro, which requires some .NET skills that we don't currently have, but we're looking to do that ourselves. So until we can get all of those custom tools converted over to work in ArcPro, we'll be continuing to work in ArcMap for our everyday editing. But ultimately, we're trying to get to using ArcPro. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, Esri has said that they're still supporting ArcMap, but I think I just heard recently they had a rep come and visit us that I think 10.6 is their last version, and they'll, you know, so they're not building out any new features in ArcMap. So it's time to start moving over.
Yeah, I've been hearing the same thing. So it's that's a very good point. We got about 8 minutes here. I just want to squeeze in some more questions and do a promotion. Ralph, he said, sorry you missed this earlier. If you explain the significance of a JSON for this. Curious to see what other programming may be involved in these types of things. You mentioned .NET, so.
Esri has, if you just Google it, Esri's got a few JSON editors. One is out on GitHub, and it's really easy to use. And so, they have instructions for how to do it. Basically, you can take a vector tile layer, like one of Esri's, like, you know, take their standard base map. You can make a copy of that item in AGO, and then you download the JSON from that item in AGO, and then you go out to the GitHub site and look for that JSON style editor, and you can bring that JSON file into their style editor. And the thing that's cool about that is that you can, you know, even if you don't have a lot of experience, you can just find RGB values in there and change them and hit run, and you can see it. You know, it's just, you know, it's just the code on the left and the raster and the vector tile on the right, so you can see it happen. And then you just save it when you're done and upload it back up to your AGO service. So that's what the editing the JSON involves. It's really pretty simple.
All right. I got Philip has asked a question, and Eric has asked them. I'll kind of combine them real fast here since we're got about 6 minutes. Can you describe the early research process on how ArcGIS Pro was able to resolve your issues? And Eric asked the question, I believe vector tile layers are not query able. Is this true?
So both of them were really simple. There wasn't a whole lot of research, you know, and Esri's good about documenting, you know, their kind of standard products, like, you know, so all this stuff about tasks and using ArcPro and vector tiles is all very well documented. So there wasn't a whole lot of research there. And they're both really simple. I mean, don't be daunted by how, or intimidated by how how big of a project it seems like it could be. I would just take an ArcPro project, throw a few layers in, and you just go right up to the share as service in the share ribbon, and one of the options is vector tiles. And if you have an AGO account, just publish it. I mean, it's that simple. From there, it's just a matter of tweaking to get the results that you want.
Very nice, very nice.
And what was the other question?
Eric asked the question, I believe vector tile layers are not queryable. Is this true?
I don't believe so through normal means, but I'm not sure programmatically in some JavaScript application if you'd be able to do that. Yeah. Perhaps. We're not doing that. Here you can see, as I'm scrolling around, some of the overlap issues. So there's probably a tile boundary somewhere in here. But you can see how the reason I kept focusing in and out on these county roads down here is you can see how nicely the labeling works. they tend to stay in one place, which is good. When you use annotation and dynamic labeling in the raster tiles, your labels tend to jump all over the place from one zoom level to the next. And they do things like here, like wraparound.
That's nice.
And when you're zooming in on features like a city, the name stays in one place as you zoom in.
All right, we have time.
Which is more like Google Maps and Esri, so it's a more pleasant viewing experience.
I definitely agree with you. So we got one last question here, and then we'll do a little advertising for our upcoming events. Megan, as a fellow state employee, she was asking and wants to know how TxDOT handled the hardware upgrades required for Arc Pro, or did you all just use existing hardware?
The hardware update, I mean, so, I mean, this is just a simple installation of Arc Pro on our desktop, and we're publishing straight to AGO. So we're not using any ArcGIS server, and we're not using, I mean, we had used Amazon before to publish, and all of that was really difficult to get done, you know, standing up the Amazon server and getting ArcGIS server to publish these services, which is ultimately why we went with super simple. Everything in one Arc Pro project. Arc Pro's easy software to manage. In fact, a nice thing about Arc Pro is you can update the software on your own. You don't have to have IT update it for you. So there was not a lot of overhead for this, quite honestly, as long as you have AGO accounts through your organization.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. It's been pretty super simple. Let's see here, Megan. One more question: how did you get the budget to buy desktops with more than 2 gigs of RAM? Okay, that will be more of a offline type thing, because I know it's difficult to talk about budgeting and stuff with different agencies. But um, any rate, we're right at the end of the presentation. Chris, I want to go ahead and thank you so much for presenting today, and we might even have to talk about getting you back to, maybe we'll put together some sort of ArcGIS Pro demonstration if you're ever interested. But I think at the height of today's presentation, we had around 84, 85 folks. Not too bad, especially after Thanksgiving. We have upcoming Mappy hours. One's in Austin. It's January the 25th at Red's Porch, Northwest Austin. I was told that there's a typo in the address, but we'll fix that and send it on out. So January 25th is our Mappy hour. We've got a December happy hour or Mappy hour, and December the 6th in Hurst, Texas at Broncos Sports Bar and Grill. You all can check our website for that one. And please attend. They're a lot of fun. It's social networking, and so you know, you get to know your colleagues, and so it should be a lot of fun. So one last thing I want to offer up here is on December the 12th here in Austin, the Austin Central Texas GIS Day is going on from noon to 5 p.m. I believe there's some stuff starting at 10 as well. Downtown Central Library, the new one. And so it's the Austin, Texas GIS Day. And so we'll post up here, you know, the web link, and by all means attend this. This should be some great presentations put on by Syntex, a colleague, you know, chapter in here in Central Texas. And I think the Texas Water Development Board is also involved, and City of Austin. So it's going to be real good. So check that out and attend that one. So Ollie, Patrick, have I missed anything?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay. Chris, once again, thanks so much. And we appreciate it. I'm Brian King, the Vice President of URISA Texas, and as your moderator today. We've got a number of other people on board, Patrick Young and Ollie Powers. We got Chris Akins. We're all involved in the chapter. So check us out next month. We'll be sending out an email blast for the next speaker series, and we'll be posting this recorded session on our YouTube channel shortly after the presentation today. So thank you all, and we're going to go ahead and sign off. Chris, once again, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much.